Hello, good evening and welcome to Biz First Review 360. On Tuesday, the Ministry of Finance released its annual report for 2017 and it makes for some very interesting reading. Of course, it's quite a ponderous document, and so we thought on this week's show we'll take a little outtakes from the Finance Ministry's annual report and to discuss some of these key points in the report. We're joined by Mr. Ravi Ratnasabapathy, a fellow of the Advocata Institute, a liberal think tank based in Colombo. Ravi, thank you very much for coming on the show once again. Among the key sort of points in the Finance Ministry annual report that you've highlighted is the fact that the government recorded a small primary surplus of 0.02% of GDP. What is a primary surplus as opposed to a surplus?
Right. A primary surplus is a surplus of income over expenditure excluding interest payments. Now, the total expenditure of the government will include the normal expenditure, the salaries, the pensions, the other subsidies, transfers, but in addition to that it will include interest. Now, at the primary level, just the recurring expenses excluding the interest are being covered by the government revenue. Now, that's very significant, because if you don't cover your basic expenditure with your income, the gap is going to have to be covered by debt. So basically, your running.
So what this basically means is that the government did not borrow money to run
its current expenditure. Now, just how significant this is, you must look back to see when we last had a primary surplus, which was in 1992, and before that just in 1954 and 1955. So every year we've been running a primary deficit and borrowing for consumption, which is similar to a family running on a credit card. Your monthly salary doesn't cover your running expenses, so then you top it up with a credit card. Then next month you've got the credit card bill to pay plus the expenses, so your hole keeps getting bigger and bigger.
So there's a small issue here though with the primary surplus being 0.02% of GDP.
Right.
Is that figure accurate, given that we've seen a clash of opinions between the Auditor General and the Central Bank on what central government's outstanding debt is as a ratio of GDP? So outstanding central government debt 77.6% of GDP at end 2017, but according to the Auditor General it's more like 80%.
Yes, I think that may be a problem of classification, whether SOE debt should be included or shouldn't be included with the government debt. I haven't looked in detail as to what that may be, but as far as the figures from the central bank are concerned as to income, expenditure and GDP, I think we can go by those. I think once before also there was an issue with the AG's figures not agreeing. It's possible that that some of these debts of semi-government institutions or SOEs may not have been included with the rest of the public debt.
Do you think it's a problem of should we listen to the auditor or the economist?
I think it would be good to just go into both figures in a little more detail and see what's
either way, regardless of how the calculation eventually works out, the 0.02% primary surplus as a percentage of GDP, is that something that the public should be excited about? Is it something that indicates progress or recovery from the debt burden?
Yes, because at least then last year you haven't had to borrow to consume. It's just the first step on a long road. What we need to do is ensure that you have a primary surplus every year. So there's another positive thing they've talked about. They do have a medium-term fiscal plan, but what we need to do is, if we can get to a hard ceiling on expenditure or a hard ceiling on the final deficit, where the government is in its 3-year calculation, it works out and sets into by Act of Parliament.
Is that a realistic goal though, Ravi, having a hard ceiling
Yes.
on expenditure? Because I mean, we have I'm going to make a few predictions here. I'm predicting that if provincial council elections are held by September this year, as the government is legally bound to do, then by September this year, government expenditure is going to shoot up by, let's say, about 5%.
Yes, that is the big fear, which is why we need to try what other countries have done. I think I spoke on this the last time I was here also. What other countries have done, we have the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Now, into the act, you pass in it's an act of parliament, and under which the government has to present its plan. But the deficit or the expenditure target for the next 3 years is also added in through the act, so it becomes a legally binding thing. It's better than having it open, so there is further pressure. So if you can get something like that in, there's much greater chance, despite the pressures of the election cycle, of trying to keep it in place. And as I mentioned the last time also, it's been used in a number of countries across Africa and across the African continent, several countries. So, and some places it has helped. So it's worth trying. It's a complex exercise, but they've already got some forecast in place. So rather than just budgeting annually, start looking at the 3 to 5 year horizon and setting your targets, and then you've got your expected revenue, you've got your expected target, and then you know this is all I can spend. So that keeps the expenditure under control.
But that system doesn't sound like it would be conducive to democracy.
No, it's very conducive to democracy, because I think all the advanced democracies do it. It's, I think, only the places that are somewhat rather worse governed that tend to go on ad hoc once a year budgeting. So that is that's all part of the process. And there are a lot of people who are annoyed, especially the professionals, and I've seen the doctors once again getting on the street asking for a 12% tax rate for themselves. But the reason for all the high taxes is the very high government expenditure. Now you've imposed taxes and you've balanced it, but now you can't allow the thing to grow anymore, and if you can, you need to reduce it. So you need to keep this under control or expect to pay more in taxes. So it's in everybody's interest to try to keep it under control and to try to bring it down if you can, which is possible if they manage it carefully and shed unnecessary activities.
On that note, we're going for a short commercial break. Of course, we all know that successive governments in Sri Lanka, or possibly every government that the country has had thus far, has been quite expert at appointing boards, but not so much on the follow-up of the work of those boards. We'll be right back with the review. Welcome back to the review. We're in conversation with Mr. Ravi Ratnasabapathy, Fellow of the Advocata Institute, a liberal think tank based here in Colombo. Now, an interesting fact that's always presented with concern to welfare and government expenditure and state-owned enterprises is the fact that the losses incurred by Sri Lankan Airlines outstrip by far the amount of money that the government spends annually on the largest welfare program, which is the Samagati.
Right.
In this backdrop, when you look at state-owned enterprises in conjunction with what you read in the Finance Ministry's annual report as well, what do you take away from it? What can you say about it?
Well, the Finance Ministry just, the report just monitors 55 of the largest state-owned enterprise. The problem is that there are simply too many, I think, to monitor, and they're never tracked properly. So there is a big problem with the accountability. Now in the report itself, if you look at the number of enterprises that have submitted annual reports, the basic control, you'll find that things like Lanka, Satosa have not submitted an annual report from 2011 onwards. So we don't know whether it's submitted, how far back the last one was submitted. You'll find several that are, the accounts are 2, 3, 4 years out of date by the time it comes. So basic governance is a huge issue. So which is why and the sheer number of them, how many people have time to go spend their time looking over, reviewing the accounts and businesses of this. It'll be a one set of ministers who may or may not have the interest in actually controlling it. For them, it's a place where they can put their constituents, give jobs, and do engage in all sorts of other malpractices as well, because the oversight is poor. So they have no interest in controlling the operation. So they continue their merry way, earning losses and burning.
I'd like to highlight this specific section from the report, which says, moreover, publishing of non-commercial obligations of state-owned business enterprises in the budget documents for 2018 enabled to recognize the quasi-fiscal cost of providing public utilities such as fuel and electricity at below-cost recovery prices, thereby improving transparency of fiscal reporting.
Yes, these are good practices. What happens is people will when you point out that enterprises are not earning a proper return, or they're running at losses or whatever, they will tell you that there is a social obligation to provide certain services at either subsidized or free at the point of consumption for users. So it's good for each enterprise if there is a statement of intent, with corporate intent, which a few of the big SOEs have already signed, and it basically says, why does this institution exist? So that's a good place to start asking the question, should this institution exist at all? So it defines why, and if you also define, okay, these are the social or non-commercial objectives, at least you have a measuring stick against which you can measure its performance. So you should go from there into key performance indicators, and which you measure how it has actually performed. So if in the health sector, you might want to see how much does it cost to vaccinate a child, how much does it cost to treat a particular patient, how much does the water board spend on purifying water, how per liter or whatever. So these are useful measures that against which you can check what kind of services are provided and whether it is cost effective or not.
The thing is, you can make that sort of justification when you talk about social obligation of certain SOEs with fuel, water, electricity, healthcare, State Pharmaceuticals Corporation, CB, CPC, NWSDB, etc., etc. You can make, there is a justification for the existence of those institutions. But what about the rest? The Sugar Development Board, the Janata Estate Development Board, the Lanka Mineral Sands. Those four are probably the larger of the state-owned enterprises, but they're certainly not. They're certainly in the minority.
In the sense, what is the source? Yes, some of those places might not have a discernible social obligation that they are providing. So in which case they need to a statement of so if they ask the hard question of why does this organization exist, if it has no social obligations, then it must have some commercial purpose to it. So that again can be assessed on purely commercial purely commercial basis. So when it comes to businesses operating in the private sector, it's purely for a profit. If it's a charitable institution, it's for whatever service. So at least if you know why this thing exists, then you will know how to measure whether it's performing or not.
Let's talk about some other big state-owned enterprises which generally turn a profit. The state banks accounted for 44% of the lending portfolio of the banking sector at 2.8 trillion rupees as at the end of 2017, an increase of 16%. The deposit base of the state banks also increased by 17% to 3.8 trillion. Now, according to reports, around half of state banks' lending is either to the state or SOEs, much of which is secured against guarantees issued by the Treasury. What does it tell you about the performance of these institutions?
Now, the state banks do report profits. Right now, the question we have to ask is, now if a good half of your lending is to the government and to other SOEs, which may be secured on guarantees given by the Treasury or letters of comfort given by the Treasury, what would happen if those letters of comfort or guarantees were withdrawn? What would the position of the state banks be? Now, in the 1990s, when the state banks were losing money and were virtually in a very poor financial position, they had been lending to state agencies which were not paying. Now, what has happened is that after the restructuring, they continue to lend to state agencies, but they get a piece of paper from the Treasury saying that the debt is guaranteed by the Treasury or a letter of comfort by the Finance Ministry, which is a little less secure than a.
But this is one of the biggest enablers for SOEs to just continue dilly-dallying along as they are.
Yes, because what happens is previously they were not getting security and the banks were showing losses. Now they have a piece of paper, and so they don't technically need to provide for all the debts that they have lent to SOEs, regardless of whether the SOE is performing or not. Now, if you look at the case of Lanka, over the last 4 years, it has accumulated about 90 billion in losses. Right, the debt has gone up from about 35 billion to about 80 odd billion. The interesting thing that you see in that is, initially, for 4 or 5 years ago, about a good chunk of the debt was being provided by the private banks. About 10% was provided by the state banks.
Quick question. Do you feel that if the state banks were to sort of withdraw, this would put some serious pressure on the restructuring process at Sri Lankan Airlines?
It would put serious pressure on the state banks themselves, because if the guarantees and it's a blank check. From the Finance Ministry, which allows the state banks to lend, and which allows them to lend without providing for the. Now the Air Lanka can't pay; it's insolvent, right? There's 49 billion of loans.
On that note, Ravi, we're going for a short commercial break. We can go into Sri Lankan Airlines in detail as soon as we come back. But is that a massive sandcastle which is about to turn into a major landslide? Air Lanka, or Sri Lankan Airlines rather, and the state banks. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the review. We're in conversation with Ravi Ratnasabapathy of the Advocata Institute. Ravi, when we left off, we were talking about the relationship between the state banks and Sri Lankan Airlines. Something that could be on the verge of, well, is already very toxic.
Yes, it's insolvent. It's insolvent. Yes, actually it's the state banks and all the state enterprises. What happens is the government, whenever the state enterprises run losses, these losses need to be financed. Right? Somebody has to pay up in cash. So what the government does is it directs them to the state banks. Now the state banks don't want to lend unless it's a profitable enterprise. So what they do is they get either a letter of comfort or a guarantee from the treasury, and against that they lend. So the state banks actually fund all the losses of the state enterprises against security that the finance ministry or the treasury provide. Now the interesting thing is, because the government runs on cash accounting, they don't account for the cost or the potential, the contingent liability associated with the guarantee. The bank itself, because it has the security of a treasury guarantee or a letter of comfort, most likely is not providing for the debts either. So there's a huge potential set of losses that are just building up within the state banks. So what will eventually happen is that periodically the government will have to keep.
So this is essentially a huge bubble within the state banking.
Yes, it's a huge black hole. The state banks fund the SOEs against guarantees given by the government, and nobody accounts really for
and
the
it's not
guarantee.
coming back. I mean,
Right.
you said it right. It's a black hole. It's being sucked in, and you're never going to
Yes, a loss is never going to be recovered. Yes, so that's one of the reasons why you need to give the state banks proper independence, and the treasury should really stop issuing guarantees. The state enterprises need to stand on their own feet and borrow. If they can't borrow on their balance sheets, then they're not fit to exist really. So that's to control that. That's one reason why you need to give them proper independence and proper and possibly float them off.
You mentioned that tax expenditure statements could be a step towards greater transparency on the
Right.
part of the country's finances. Tax expenditure statement quantifies the fiscal cost of exclusions, exemptions, or reductions from the tax base in order to provide a special credit, a preferential rate of tax, or a deferral of tax liability. For the benefit of our viewers, can you explain, and for me as well,
Right.
how a tax expenditure statement
Right.
will be helpful?
Yeah, that's again one of the very positive things that we see coming out in this report. Now, what a tax expenditure report does, it assesses the cost of the subsidies that are given to groups that may be enjoying lower rates of tax. For example, now we have a standard corporate income tax rate of 28%. You have a rate of 40% that applies to tobacco, alcohol, but you also have a 14% rate that applies to certain selected categories. Now, what something like a tax expenditure statement would do is it would compute the revenue foregone by the government by offering a 14% rate to a certain category of business, as opposed to applying the standard 28% rate that would apply. So then both from a policy perspective, it's possible to see what the approximate cost of the subsidy. So when it comes to discussions about is the tax system fair, we have some basis to see, okay, certain sectors have asked, or the government has, as a matter of policy, given preferential rates to certain areas. What does it cost? And then we can have some reasonable discussion about the fairness
So
of the
essentially
tax system.
this will lead to also in a sense greater public oversight as well.
Yes, greater public awareness. Now, if the new Indian Revenue Act, previously there was 10% tax rates, 11% tax rates that were applicable to various sectors of the economy. Now, they've consolidated all of that into one 14% band that is applicable to certain levels of SMEs, tourism, agriculture, certain things like that. And others, everybody's sort of been pushed into this 28% band. So there are fewer of those. Ideally, you should have standardized simple taxes. One rate applies to everybody, but there may be occasion to grant some special relief to certain sectors. So we know what this relief is costing us roughly. So that's the idea. Ideally, you should.
The thing is, you also have to look at not just in terms of the relief that you're granting, but also the dividends that you receive from the businesses or the growing industries that you have given concessions to.
Yes, what would happen is that the government would not be receiving that because the taxes come from within the private economy. So what happens is the government is foregoing that, or the taxpayers. Sorry, it's not the government's money; it's the taxpayers' money. The taxpayers are effectively subsidizing certain sectors for you'll have a value. So then it's possible to see, okay, if it was the tourism sector, what kind of profits did they report, what kind of dividends did they pay. Those questions can be asked. Yeah.
But there's also, I mean, would you consider it an investment, like a future, your let's say you take the tourism sector or the IT BPO with a preferential tax rate, you can tax them more in the future.
Yes, yes, but then the question that the businesses that are paying the 28% taxes, why is it me that's paying 28%, and why is that person getting 12% or 14%? So the pressure is for people to keep lobbying and trying to move their tax rates, which is how actually that whole mishmash of 10%, 12%, 14%, the old rates that we had came about. Various sectors were lobbying and getting special preferences to suit for their own personal benefit.
And it's not just industries anymore. Now it's people in specific professions who also want tax concessions.
Yes. Our most famous trade union is the doctors is ever on the street. I think they're more on the street than they're in the hospitals. But yes. So various.
Do you think that economists should also ask for a preferential tax rate? You'd rather pay your taxes?
No, from an economic perspective, what you want is a stable, simple tax system, but with as few exemptions as possible. We don't like it, right? Nobody likes paying taxes, which is why everybody is complaining about the taxes. But the question we need to ask is, what is the state actually doing with the money that it is collecting? The real burden is the government expenditure, not the amount that it's taxing. So are you getting value? Is it being spent wisely? Is it being spent on things that we need? These are the questions that we keep needing to ask. So are you doing unnecessary things? Are you neglecting what is actually necessary, which is, I think, a lot of the time that is what is happening. They do what is expedient without necessarily doing what is necessary.
Ravi, thank you very much. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. I look forward to going into the Finance Ministry's Annual Report 2017 in more detail with you in the future. But there you have it. No one likes paying taxes. That's a fact. But everyone should question what their tax rupees are being spent on. Is it just expediency, or is it what is necessary? That's the review. I'll see you again same time, same place next week. Don't forget to look us up on Facebook. You'll find us at BizFirst Review 360. I'm Nadim Majid. Good night and good luck.